I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
There exists, I have often observed, a peculiar deception in nature's most beautiful moments. She adorns her deadliest traps with the most innocent of faces. Snow, for instance, wears virtue upon its crystalline sleeve, yet beneath its pristine surface lie hidden crevasses, treacherous precipices, and the coldest of graves. On that February morning when our affair began, the legendary Glacier Express emerged from Zermatt station with the punctual grace that only Swiss engineering can achieve, carrying within its luxurious carriages a collection of passengers whose secrets would soon prove far more dangerous than the alpine wilderness surrounding them. The sky stretched above us in that impossible shade of blue that exists only in the high mountains, while the peaks themselves, those magnificent sentinels of stone and ice, stood in majestic isolation, their snow-covered faces catching the morning light like scattered diamonds. Inside the panoramic dining car, civilization reigned supreme. Crisp white linens, gleaming silver service, and the subtle perfume of fine coffee mingling with the scent of polished wood and leather. Through the vast windows, one could observe that curious social alchemy that luxury travel invariably produces, the mingling of old money with new, of titled nobility with industrial titans, of those who ski for pleasure with those who conduct business in the shadows of mountains. I was present on that fateful journey in the company of my friend Hercule Poirot, who had arranged himself with characteristic precision in a corner seat of the observation car. My dear friend resembled nothing so much as an impeccably dressed sparrow settled upon velvet cushions, his back positioned just so to ensure the morning light fell at the most flattering angle upon his tie. A shade of green so definitive it seemed to challenge the very mountains to match its vibrancy. His famous mustaches, tended with the devotion of a monk caring for his garden, maintained their perfect symmetry despite the gentle swaying of the train. His patent leather shoes gleamed with such intensity they seemed to admonish the pristine snow outside to achieve greater brilliance. Switzerland, Poirot had declared upon boarding, is admirable for two essential qualities, mon ami Hastings: the punctuality and the cleanliness. A nation that arranges its railways with such precision is not to be dismissed lightly. We were bound for St. Moritz, ostensibly for a restorative holiday, though I harbored private dreams of attempting the ski slopes, dreams that Poirot had rejected with visible horror. Non, non, he had insisted. To attach planks to the feet is to insult the very feet that carry Hercule Poirot with such dignity. They do not require assistance in maintaining my reputation. Our fellow passengers had settled into their journey with that particular air of languid sophistication that accompanies great wealth and unlimited time. Among them, certain faces immediately invited speculation, as some letters demand opening simply by their very existence. The most prominent figure was undoubtedly Herr Caspar Hertig, the renowned Swiss banker, whose discretion was as legendary as his wealth. A substantial man in his 60s, Hertig possessed the solid bearing of one who had never questioned the cost of his next meal, though his waistcoat buttons strained somewhat against the evidence of his prosperity. His pale, intelligent eyes moved constantly between his fellow passengers and a leather dispatch case that rested at his feet, secured by a slender chain that disappeared beneath his trouser cuff. The Hertig Bank of Zurich was whispered to know everything about European finance while revealing nothing, a reputation that had made its owner both indispensable and, one imagined, numerous enemies. Seated nearby was a woman whose beauty carried that particular danger that becomes most potent in silence. Mademoiselle Odette Hertig, for the name tags on her luggage revealed her connection to the banker, appeared to be in her early 30s, with the refined features and careful composure of one accustomed to being observed. She read from a French philosophical text, her ungloved hands turning pages with deliberate grace, though I noticed her eyes occasionally straying to her companion with an expression that suggested their relationship extended far beyond mere family connection. The Reverend Arthur Blythe, a tall Anglican clergyman with a remarkably noble brow and gentle mouth, had positioned himself near the dining car's entrance, offering benevolent smiles to all while engaging none in extended conversation. His explanation for the journey, recovery from a most trying parish year, seemed insufficient to explain the tension that occasionally flickered across his otherwise serene features. Mrs. Dulcie Reeford, an elegant Englishwoman wrapped in sumptuous sable, maintained animated conversation with a young man introduced as her brother, Edward Harper. Their interaction possessed that particular quality of forced lightness that often conceals deeper currents. Her laughter rang perhaps too brilliantly for the early hour, while his responses carried the careful deference of one whose financial security depended upon another's goodwill. Dr. Greta Baumann of Geneva, a precise woman with neat black hair and the clinical gaze of her profession, observed her fellow passengers with the detached interest of one accustomed to diagnosing conditions before symptoms became apparent. Near the car's far end, the celebrated contralto Madame Isabelle Varenne held court with her manager, a rotund Italian whose hands seemed perpetually engaged in conducting invisible orchestras. As we climbed toward the Oberalp Pass, the morning's crystalline clarity began to surrender to more ominous signs. First came individual snowflakes, tentative scouts of what was to follow, then a steadily thickening curtain of white that gradually obscured the magnificent vistas beyond our windows. The steward, a competent Swiss named Klaus, moved through the car with practiced efficiency, distributing luncheon menus and attending to the particular requirements of his distinguished passengers. It was Herr Hertig who proved most exacting in his demands. The tisane, he instructed with the precision that characterized all his communications. Fennel with an addition of verbena. You have it prepared, yes? The steward nodded with the familiarity of previous encounters. I observed a brief exchange of glances between Hertig and Mademoiselle Odette, a look that spoke neither of familial affection nor romantic attachment, but rather of negotiation postponed. The avalanche, when it came, announced itself with surprising gentleness, merely a soft pressure against the train's flank, as though some giant hand had reached out to halt our progress with paternal firmness. The sensation lasted only moments, but its implications rippled through the car as passengers turned to one another with expressions carefully arranged to suggest they had anticipated such events all along. Conductor Henri Dubois appeared with admirable promptness, his manner grave but reassuring. Mesdames et messieurs, he announced in the careful multilingual tone of international service, we have encountered a minor avalanche. Nothing severe, I assure you. The track is partially blocked, but the snowplow is already en route. We shall experience a delay, but there is no cause for concern. Relief breathed through the car like a collective sigh. Someone ventured a jest about being entombed until spring, while Madame Varenne clutched her manager's arm with theatrical alarm. The Reverend Blythe murmured what I assumed were comforting words, though the ski instructor, a weathered man whose face resembled old wood, smiled with what seemed indecent pleasure at our predicament. Herr Hertig rose shortly after the conductor's announcement, gathering his precious dispatch case with the fussiness of one unaccustomed to having his schedule disrupted. He exchanged a few low words with Mademoiselle Odette, who responded with a sharp shake of her head. Turning to the steward, he reminded the man of his tisane order and announced his intention to take his refreshment in the private compartment he had reserved for the journey. At that moment, Caspar Hertig appeared very much a man in complete control of his circumstances, certainly not one standing at death's threshold. Perhaps 20 minutes passed before we heard it, a sound that registered initially as insignificant, but then called forth from memory's deeper chambers a sense of alarm entirely disproportionate to its volume. It was a cry, not loud but ragged, as though the throat producing it had been surprised to find itself employed for such purpose. The sound emanated from the corridor leading to the private compartments. Conductor Dubois moved swiftly toward the disturbance, followed by several passengers drawn by curiosity's inexorable pull. Mrs. Reeford materialized from seemingly nowhere, her sable thrown back and her face bright with anticipation. Dr. Baumann accompanied the conductor with the calm efficiency of one walking toward familiar disaster, while the Reverend Blythe hovered at the group's periphery. Before Hertig's compartment door, we discovered the steward Klaus, his face drained of color and his hands trembling. "It is Herr Hertig," he managed to say. "He does not respond to my knocking." The door was locked, its small exterior window obscured by snow plastered against the glass. No sound emerged from within. Dubois knocked with professional courtesy. "Monsieur Hertig, this is the conductor." Silence greeted his efforts. "Is there any possibility," Mrs. Reeford demanded breathlessly, "of our being buried alive? I shall certainly faint if burial is to be our fate." "Madame," Dr. Baumann replied with admirable composure, "should you faint, I shall revive you immediately." To the conductor she added, "Break the lock. There may be medical necessity." Dubois produced the master key that reminded one that privacy aboard trains remains, at best, a relative concept. The door swung open to reveal a compartment spacious enough for dignity, yet intimate enough to make the scene within impossible to avoid. Caspar Hertig sat slumped against the cushions, his head fallen slightly sideways, his eyes half open, with an expression that might have been surprise, frozen into permanent contempt. One hand hung slack at his side. The other, and this detail interested me even through the shock, rested not upon his precious dispatch case, which was conspicuously absent, but upon the small table where a porcelain cup sat half empty, its bottom bearing a residue like captured moonlight. Dr. Baumann reached him first, placing 2 fingers against his throat before gently closing his eyelids. "He is dead," she announced with clinical finality. The sound people make when they must suddenly breathe filled the corridor. The Reverend Blythe began a prayer beneath his breath. The steward made a small animal noise and covered his mouth as though to prevent worse sounds from escaping. Mrs. Reeford, who had been prepared to faint moments before, now stared with the avidity of one determined to extract full value from her ticket. "The dispatch case," observed young Harper, in a voice tight with realization. "Where has it gone?" Conductor Dubois looked down, then knelt to peer beneath the seat. "It is gone," he said with the disbelief of one whose orderly world had suddenly betrayed its fundamental principles. "Mon Dieu. Has there been an accident?" The voice, cool and controlled, belonged to Mademoiselle Odette, who stood in the doorway with one pale hand gripping the frame. Her eyes went immediately to Hertig's face and, after the briefest pause, looked away. "What has occurred?" "Monsieur Hertig is dead," Dr. Baumann replied simply. Odette's lips parted in what appeared genuine shock, though whether authentic or expertly performed remained to be determined. Throughout this drama, I had been conscious of my friend's absence from the gathering crowd. Turning back toward the main car, I discovered Poirot exactly where I had left him, immaculate and composed, one hand resting upon the other with photographic precision. He had not joined the curious throng, but instead sat with his head tilted slightly, his remarkable eyes fixed not upon the compartment where death had visited, but upon the people surrounding it. "Hastings," he said in a voice pitched for my ears alone as I approached, "be so good as to observe, without making any conspicuous gesture, the shoes of the mademoiselle who has just arrived and the hands of our steward." "Her shoes," I repeated, startled and immediately conscious of my inadequacy at such observations. "And the steward's hands, my dear fellow, what do you suppose?" "I suppose nothing," he interrupted gently. "I never suppose. I arrange facts. For the moment, we shall allow the good conductor to make his necessary announcements and establish that no one leaves this carriage. The authorities will be summoned, and we shall be delayed." He gave the smallest of sighs as though adjusting a sheet to perfect flatness. "It is unfortunate. Also, it is inevitable. There will be a great deal more snow today." His tone was so perfectly unruffled that I, who knew him well, felt the thrill of anticipation beneath its surface. A man had died in a small, elegant room. An object accustomed to being chained had taken inexplicable flight. The snow had drawn a white curtain across our stage. The players were assembled. The little grey cells, I knew with certainty, were already assuming their positions. From the corridor came Conductor Dubois' grave voice, making proper announcements in 3 languages. The police would be contacted immediately. The train would proceed as soon as conditions permitted. No one should panic. No one, if they would be so kind, should leave the saloon car without express permission. The mountains stood motionless in their ancient patience and waited. Thus began the affair that would test even Hercule Poirot's legendary powers of deduction, as our luxurious train became a prison of ice and snow, carrying within its elegant confines a killer who walked among us, hidden behind a mask of respectability and grief. The conductor's pronouncement settled over the saloon car like a shroud, transforming what had been merely an inconvenient delay into something far more sinister. The elegant passengers, who moments before had been concerned only with missed appointments and delayed luncheons, now found themselves regarding one another with the wary calculation of those who suddenly realize they are sharing quarters with a killer. Mrs. Reeford was the first to break the heavy silence, her voice carrying that peculiar mixture of excitement and indignation that tragedy often produces in those safely removed from its immediate consequences. "But surely this is a matter for the police. We cannot simply remain here with—" She gestured delicately toward the corridor where death had visited. "With that situation unresolved." "Madame," Conductor Dubois replied with admirable patience, though perspiration had begun to gather at his temples. "The authorities have been contacted by wireless. However, the avalanche has created difficulties both ahead and behind us. We are, for the present moment, quite isolated." Young Edward Harper stepped forward, his boyish features drawn with what appeared to be genuine concern. "How long might we expect to remain in this position? My sister has a delicate constitution. Such shocks can prove overwhelming to sensitive nerves." I observed Mrs. Reeford, who possessed all the delicacy of a cavalry charge, flutter her gloved hand against her throat with practiced fragility. The performance was accomplished, if transparent. Dr. Baumann emerged from Hertig's compartment at that moment, closing the door with decisive firmness behind her. Her clinical gaze swept the assembled group as she announced, "I have conducted a preliminary examination. The deceased shows no obvious signs of violence. However, given the circumstances, the missing dispatch case, I would recommend treating this as a suspicious death until proven otherwise." "Suspicious?" The question came from Mademoiselle Odette, whose pale composure had begun to show hairline cracks. "But if there are no signs of violence, surely Uncle Caspar suffered a natural seizure of some kind." The Reverend Blythe cleared his throat with clerical gentleness. "Perhaps the case was removed after the gentleman's unfortunate passing, an opportunistic theft rather than—" He hesitated delicately. "Something more deliberate." "Opportunity." The weathered ski instructor spoke for the first time since the discovery, his voice carrying the dry skepticism of one accustomed to watching others navigate treacherous terrain. Hertig wasn't a man to travel with anything ordinary. His reputation suggested he carried documents worth considerable sums to the right purchaser. This observation fell among the passengers like a stone into still water, creating expanding ripples of unease. I noticed how each person's gaze moved involuntarily to their companions, as though seeing them clearly for the first time. It was then that Poirot rose from his corner seat with fluid precision, his patent leather shoes making no sound upon the carpeted floor. The small commotion had drawn everyone's attention, but my friend had remained curiously detached, observing rather than participating in the general alarm. Now, however, he approached Conductor Dubois with the measured steps of one who has reached a decision. "Monsieur Dubois," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to halt the nervous chatter. "Permit me to introduce myself. I am Hercule Poirot." The conductor's eyebrows rose in immediate recognition. The detective? "Mon Dieu, I've read of your cases in Le Figaro." "Précisément. Under these circumstances, with the proper authorities unable to reach us immediately, perhaps it would be wise to preserve the scene with utmost care. I would be honored to assist in maintaining correct procedure until the officials arrive." Dubois' relief was visible and immediate. "Monsieur Poirot, if you would be so kind, your reputation precedes you. I confess I'm not entirely certain of proper protocol in such matters. Naturellement. We shall ensure that when the authorities do arrive, they will find everything exactly as it should be." Poirot's gaze swept the assembled passengers with that peculiar intensity that seemed to catalogue and file away every detail. "First, however, I must examine the scene while it remains undisturbed by well-meaning interference." Within Hertig's compartment, the air carried the lingering scent of fennel and something else. Something Poirot's sensitive nostrils detected but did not immediately identify. The banker sat as Dr. Baumann had left him, covered by a crisp white napkin, his final posture suggesting surprise rather than pain. Poirot did not touch the body, but stood at a careful distance, his remarkable eyes moving with methodical precision. "The window latch. Firmly secured," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "The chain attached to his dispatch case. Observe, Hastings, how it has been forced, not cut cleanly, but wrenched apart with considerable violence. The clasp shows fresh scoring where metal tools have been applied." He bent toward the small table where the porcelain cup sat, its bottom bearing a faint opalescent residue. "Aniseed from the fennel, certainly, but something else." His nostrils flared delicately. "No, it is not yet decisive." Klaus, the steward, hovered anxiously in the doorway, his face pale and his hands trembling. Following Poirot's earlier instruction, I observed those hands more closely and noticed what my friend had already detected: an irregular reddening between thumb and forefinger, as though from a recent scald, and a faint, sticky brightness on the nail of his little finger. "You brought the tisane as requested?" Poirot inquired gently. "Oui, monsieur. At precisely 11:52, I noted the time on the dining car clock. I knocked, Herr Hertig opened the door, accepted the tray, and closed the door immediately. That was all." "And the avalanche occurred when?" "Perhaps 6 minutes later, 11:58. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "The door was locked when Conductor Dubois arrived." "Yes, monsieur. I used the master key. The bolt inside springs back automatically when turned from outside. So anyone possessing such a key could enter and secure the door again upon leaving. How many keys exist?" "2. Only. Mine and the conductor's." As we returned to the main carriage, I observed how the group's dynamic had shifted. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, glances carried new weight, and the comfortable anonymity of luxury travel had evaporated entirely. Each person now existed as both observer and potential suspect in a deadly game whose rules were only beginning to emerge. Poirot settled into his seat with characteristic precision, adjusting his tie and smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his sleeve. Through the panoramic windows, the snow continued its relentless descent, transforming our elegant prison into an island of suspicion floating in an ocean of white. "So, mon ami," he said quietly, his voice pitched for my ears alone. "The stage is perfectly arranged. A locked room, a valuable object vanished, and a collection of individuals, each harboring their own secrets. The snow ensures our little drama remains perfectly contained until the final curtain falls." His eyes moved systematically from passenger to passenger, cataloguing details that escaped ordinary observation. The investigation, Hastings, it begins not with questions, but with watching. For in the first moments after discovery, before people have time to arrange their faces properly, the truth often reveals itself in the smallest gestures. The hunt, I realized with familiar anticipation, had truly begun. The atmosphere in the saloon car had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. What had begun as a collection of strangers sharing luxurious accommodations had evolved into something far more sinister, a gathering of suspects, each now viewing their companions through the lens of potential guilt. Poirot observed this metamorphosis with the keen interest of a naturalist studying a rare species, noting how isolation and suspicion refined the edges of each carefully constructed facade. He rose with characteristic precision, approaching Conductor Dubois with the measured steps of one who had reached a decision. "Monsieur Dubois," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention. "Before we proceed further, I must understand the exact preparation of the tisane. Each detail, if you please." The conductor gestured toward Klaus, whose pallor had deepened since the discovery. The steward's hands trembled slightly as he began his account. I prepared it precisely as Herr Hertig always requested. The water boiled in the small copper kettle, his personal sachets of fennel and verbena, kept in a sealed tin behind the sherry, a spoonful of honey from our common jar. "The sealed tin," Poirot interrupted gently. "You mentioned this seal." "Oui, monsieur, a narrow strip of paper gummed across the lid. Herr Hertig insisted it be replaced after each use. He was most particular about such things." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. A precaution against tampering, one might suppose. "And this morning the seal was intact when you prepared his tisane?" Klaus nodded emphatically, though perspiration had begun to gather at his temples. "Perfectly intact, monsieur. I broke it myself at 11:45. "And your hands?" Poirot observed with delicate precision. "They show signs of recent injury. The reddening between thumb and forefinger. How did this occur?" The steward's face flushed. The kettle handle was hotter than expected. A minor scald, nothing more." Poirot nodded thoughtfully before turning his attention to Mademoiselle Odette, who sat rigidly upright, her philosophical text forgotten in her lap. Her pale hands were clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white beneath her skin. "Mademoiselle," he began with that particular courtesy that somehow managed to be both respectful and inexorable, "permit me to express my condolences on the loss of your uncle. You mentioned earlier that he intended to make an announcement at luncheon." Her response came with careful precision, as though each word had been weighed before utterance. Uncle Caspar had been considering certain changes to his business arrangements, family matters that would affect several people. "Including yourself?" The question struck her like a physical blow, though she recovered with admirable speed. "I work as a translator in Geneva, Monsieur Poirot. My uncle occasionally engaged my services, but I was not privy to his deeper business concerns." Young Harper, who had been listening with evident unease, suddenly interjected. "If we're discussing business connections, I should mention that I worked in banking myself until recently. In London, the Hertig Bank was well known in financial circles, though their operations were always conducted with utmost discretion." This revelation fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. Poirot's head tilted with that bird-like attention that indicated his complete focus. "How fascinating, Monsieur Harper. And your departure from banking, was this by choice?" Harper's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "The economic situation has made employment challenging. I accompany my sister for her health, but I confess I'd hoped this journey might provide opportunities for new connections." Mrs. Reeford placed a restraining hand upon her brother's arm, her eyes bright with an excitement that seemed inappropriate to the gravity of their situation. "Edward, surely such details are unnecessary." "Au contraire, madame," Poirot interrupted smoothly. "In circumstances such as these, every detail possesses potential significance." His gaze swept the assembled group once more, cataloguing the subtle signs that escaped ordinary observation. Following his earlier instruction, I noticed the crescent of grey smudge that marred Mademoiselle Odette's right shoe and the fine sugar-like crystals that clung near the heel. Details that spoke of movement through areas where such substances might be found. What we have established thus far, Poirot continued in his methodical way, is that Herr Hertig was a man of precise habits and careful precautions, carrying valuable documents, who died alone while his precious dispatch case vanished entirely. Someone among us possessed both the means and the motive to accomplish this feat. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, emphasizing their isolation and the impossibility of escape. Conductor Dubois approached with obvious reluctance. "Monsieur Poirot, the wireless reports that the snowplow will be delayed until late afternoon. We remain, for the present, entirely cut off." Poirot's smile held no warmth. "Excellent. Time, Hastings, is the friend of order and the enemy of deception. The longer our killer remains trapped with us, the more likely they are to reveal themselves through the very human need to appear innocent." The investigation had begun in earnest, and already the carefully constructed facades were beginning to show hairline cracks. Poirot's announcement regarding the preservation of luggage had the desired effect of crystallizing the group's anxiety into something more focused and immediate. The casual atmosphere of enforced delay had transformed entirely into the charged tension of formal investigation. My friend observed this metamorphosis with evident satisfaction, his keen eyes cataloguing each subtle shift in posture and expression that betrayed inner turmoil. "Before we proceed further," he announced with characteristic precision, "we must establish the exact sequence of events. Time, mes amis, is the skeleton upon which all truth hangs." He gestured toward Conductor Dubois. "If you would be so kind as to bring the dining car chronometer here, we shall ensure all references are made to one authoritative timepiece." When the brass clock was positioned prominently upon the central table, Poirot began his systematic examination of the crucial period. Between 11:45, when Klaus prepared the tisane, and 12:08, when the steward's cry was heard, precisely 23 minutes elapsed. Within this narrow window, someone accomplished murder and theft with remarkable efficiency. Dr. Baumann cleared her throat with clinical authority. "Monsieur Poirot, permit me to contribute a medical observation that may prove significant. During my examination of the deceased, I noted that his pupils were markedly constricted, a condition inconsistent with natural death. Additionally, there was a faint, sweet odor about his person, beneath the aniseed of the fennel." This revelation sent a visible tremor through the assembled passengers. Poirot's eyebrows rose with evident interest. "The pupils, they are most informative. And this sweet odor, you detected it elsewhere." "In the residue at the bottom of the tisane cup, though masked by the herbs. I should mention that I recognized Herr Hertig from my practice in Geneva. Several months ago, I prescribed chloral hydrate for his chronic insomnia, a mild sedative that, in excessive quantities, produces exactly the symptoms I observed." The implications struck the group like a physical blow. Mademoiselle Odette's carefully maintained composure faltered visibly, while young Harper shifted with obvious discomfort. The Reverend Blythe's gentle features contracted with concern. "Chloral hydrate," Poirot mused thoughtfully, "dissolves readily in hot liquids and possesses a distinctly sweet taste easily masked by honey and herbs. Most illuminating, Doctor." Klaus, who had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange, suddenly burst forth with barely controlled anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot, I must confess, Herr Hertig was not the only passenger to request special preparations this morning. Mademoiselle Odette asked for access to the service pantry at 11:15, claiming she wished to prepare a tisane using herbs brought from Geneva." The silence that followed was electric with accusation. Every eye turned toward Mademoiselle Odette, whose pale features now showed unmistakable signs of distress. "The herbs?" Poirot inquired with deceptive gentleness. "What became of them?" Klaus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She said she had changed her mind and asked me to dispose of the packet. I placed it in the waste receptacle. It has not been emptied." "Most curious behavior," Poirot observed, "for one suffering from nervous complaints during a stressful journey." Rising with fluid precision, he moved toward the service pantry, gesturing for the group to follow. In that narrow space of chrome and enamel, his remarkable eyes missed nothing. He examined the honey jar with particular attention, noting the crystalline residue on its inner surface, then crouched to study a dark patch upon the floor beside the mat. "Honey crystallizes in the cold," he murmured, passing a fingertip over the spot. When he lifted it, the tip bore a faint, sticky brightness along with minute pale crystals. "Someone dripped it here recently. And observe," he indicated an almost invisible crescent mark, "the print of a narrow heel that has trodden through the patch." My eyes involuntarily flicked toward Mademoiselle Odette's shoes, noting again the grey smudge and crystalline dusting that Poirot had earlier observed. "You don't understand," she said desperately, her voice rising. "Yes, I brought herbs from Geneva, but for my own nervous condition. I prepared a mild sedative for personal use, nothing sinister." "And yet," Poirot replied with inexorable logic, "you chose to dispose of these harmless herbs rather than consume them yourself. Most peculiar." The weathered ski instructor, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, suddenly spoke with dry observation. "In the mountains, the most dangerous avalanches often begin with the smallest disturbance. A single misstep can bring down an entire mountainside." His words carried ominous weight that seemed to encompass far more than meteorological wisdom, and I noticed how several passengers shifted uncomfortably under his knowing gaze. The net was tightening with methodical precision, yet something in Mademoiselle Odette's desperate protest suggested the truth might prove more complex than initial appearances indicated. The weight of circumstantial evidence had begun to settle around Mademoiselle Odette like a closing net, yet Poirot regarded the mounting case against her with that peculiar expression I had learned to recognize as profound skepticism. Rising with characteristic precision, he approached Klaus with the measured steps of one following a predetermined path. "The herbs that Mademoiselle Odette discarded," he said gently. "We shall examine them now, if you please." Klaus retrieved the small waste receptacle with obvious reluctance, and Poirot bent to study its contents without disturbing them. The glassine envelope lay among the refuse exactly as described, its contents visible through the transparent material. Poirot's sensitive nostrils detected the faint, pleasant scent that emanated from within. "Melissa and verbena," he murmured with evident satisfaction. "A most gentle combination, suitable for calming the nerves of an entire regiment, but quite incapable of harming a banker." He straightened, his remarkable eyes moving to the assembled group. "The herbs are precisely as Mademoiselle Odette described, harmless preparations for nervous complaints." This observation created a visible stir among the passengers. Dr. Baumann frowned with professional confusion, while Conductor Dubois shifted uncomfortably. The case that had seemed so conclusive moments before was developing troubling complications. "But surely," Mrs. Rayford protested with characteristic determination, "the evidence of the honey upon her shoe, the access to the service area, these facts cannot be dismissed so easily." "Au contraire, madame," Poirot replied with gentle firmness. "Facts must never be dismissed, but neither must they be forced into conclusions they cannot properly support. Consider this temporal difficulty. Klaus prepared the tisane at 11:45, using herbs from a sealed container. Mademoiselle Odette accessed the pantry at 11:15, 30 minutes before the preparation began. How does one poison a tisane that does not yet exist? The logic of this observation struck the group with the force of revelation. The timeline that had seemed to support Odette's guilt now appeared to exonerate her, at least from the most direct method of murder. Young Harper cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps the poison was introduced after preparation but before delivery. An astute possibility, Poirot acknowledged. Klaus, during your journey from service area to compartment, did you encounter anyone? The steward's anxiety returned in full force. Yes, monsieur. Dr. Baumann was returning from the lavatory as I approached Herr Hertig's door. She inquired about his health, mentioning previous treatment. All eyes turned toward the Geneva physician, whose clinical composure remained admirably steady. I did encounter Klaus briefly. Herr Hertig had consulted me regarding chronic insomnia several months ago. I naturally inquired about his condition during travel, but I neither touched the tray nor approached close enough to interfere with its contents. Yet you possessed intimate knowledge of his medical history, Poirot observed with delicate precision, including his use of chloral hydrate. You would understand precisely the dosage required to prove fatal. My medical knowledge is extensive, certainly, Dr. Baumann replied with professional dignity, but my oath prevents me from using such knowledge for harm. What possible motive could I have for murdering a patient who paid promptly and caused no difficulties? At this moment, Mademoiselle Odette, who had been following the exchange with growing agitation, suddenly spoke with the desperate clarity of one who sees salvation slipping away. You don't understand the full situation. Yes, I had reason to fear Uncle Caspar, but not for the reasons you might suspect. Her confession came with the brittle quality of glass under pressure. I'd been providing information to competitors about his business dealings. Not state secrets, nothing treasonous, but enough to earn substantial payments from interested parties. He discovered this arrangement 3 weeks ago and threatened to destroy my reputation entirely unless I provided him with the names of my contacts. This revelation struck the group like a physical blow. The Reverend Blythe's gentle features contracted with disappointment, while even Dr. Baumann's clinical composure showed signs of strain. So you possessed clear motive, Poirot observed thoughtfully. Yet the physical evidence suggests you could not have accomplished the deed through direct poisoning of the tisane. The ski instructor, who had been observing these developments with evident amusement, suddenly interjected with dry wisdom. In the mountains, the most dangerous avalanches often begin with the smallest disturbance. What appears stable on the surface may conceal deep instability beneath. His words carried undertones that seemed to encompass far more than meteorological observation, and I noticed how his weathered hands moved with the unconscious precision of one accustomed to handling delicate equipment. Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze moving systematically from passenger to passenger. The evidence presents us with a curious paradox. We have a locked room, a missing dispatch case, and a collection of individuals each harboring secrets. Yet the most obvious solution, his eyes rested briefly on Mademoiselle Odette, contains logical impossibilities that cannot be ignored. He moved toward the window, studying the relentless snowfall with apparent fascination. The real killer remains among us, mes amis, and they have demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their planning. Until we identify them correctly, we all remain in potential danger. Outside, the storm continued its assault, emphasizing their isolation and the impossibility of escape. Someone in this elegant prison had committed murder with cunning that matched their ruthlessness, and the investigation was entering its most delicate phase, where surface appearances would give way to deeper truths, and Poirot's legendary powers of psychological deduction would be tested by an adversary whose methods defied conventional logic. The net was closing, but around whom remained the crucial question that would determine whether justice or catastrophe awaited them in the white wilderness of the Alps. Poirot's declaration about their continued peril had the immediate effect of focusing the group's scattered anxieties into something more purposeful. Rising with characteristic precision, he moved to the center of the saloon car, his remarkable eyes cataloging each face with methodical attention. "We shall now proceed systematically," he announced with quiet authority. "Each person will account for their movements between 11:45, when Klaus prepared the tisane, and 12:08, when death was discovered. Not confessions or theories, mes amis, but simple facts. The truth she often hides in the smallest details." He began with the Reverend Blythe, whose gentle features maintained their characteristic serenity. "I remained near the entrance to the dining car," the clergyman replied with careful precision. "I was reading my breviary when the avalanche struck. Shortly thereafter, I walked to the vestibule windows to observe the snow conditions. I spoke briefly with our ski instructor before returning to my seat." The weathered instructor nodded confirmation. "The Reverend stood by the windows perhaps 3 minutes. I remained near the corridor junction, smoking. The ventilation carries the scent poorly in such weather." He produced a silver cigarette case, returning it to his pocket with economical movement. "Dr. Baumann." Poirot's attention shifted to the Geneva physician. "I visited the lavatory facilities and returned directly to my seat," she replied with clinical brevity. "I observed nothing unusual during my brief absence." Young Harper cleared his throat nervously. "I was writing correspondence at the small writing desk when the train shuddered. I assisted Klaus in steadying some glassware that had shifted, then remained in the main car." Klaus nodded reluctantly. "The gentleman helped with a bottle of schnapps, oui. Then I prepared Herr Hertig's tisane and delivered it precisely at 11:52. Mrs. Rayford adjusted her sable with characteristic drama. "I was in the powder room when that dreadful sensation occurred. One cannot mistake such violence. I returned immediately to find everyone in quite a state of alarm." Mademoiselle Odette's voice was barely audible. "I did not leave my seat after 11:20. I had no reason to approach Uncle Caspar's compartment, and he would not have welcomed such intrusion." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then addressed a new question to the group. "The dispatch case. What, in your estimation, might it have contained? We violate no confidences. We merely speculate based on Herr Hertig's reputation." Mademoiselle Odette spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of intimate knowledge. "Bearer bonds, certainly, but also correspondence regarding a proposed merger between 2 shipping concerns. Uncle Caspar often brokered such arrangements for substantial fees." Young Harper's breath caught almost inaudibly. There were rumors in London banking circles. Hertig was said to facilitate introductions between parties who preferred discretion in their negotiations. "Which suggests," Poirot observed with delicate precision, "that the case contained documents of value to numerous individuals, for numerous reasons." It was then that the Reverend Blythe raised a diffident hand. "Forgive me, but I may have observed something significant during my visit to the vestibule. When I looked through the glass toward the corridor, I glimpsed a figure bent at an unusual angle near the compartment area, as though adjusting a shoe or retrieving something from the floor." Every eye turned toward him with sharp attention. "Which passenger?" Poirot inquired with evident interest. "I could not determine identity. The snow was obscuring the windows, and I saw only a dark coat. But there was something else, a glint of metal near the floor level. It struck me as curious, though I thought little of it at the time." This revelation sent a visible tremor through the assembled passengers. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Metal, you say? Conductor Dubois, who has access to tools aboard this train?" "The engineering staff, naturally," Dubois replied with growing unease. "But we maintain a small toolkit beneath the service sideboard for minor repairs. It requires no special authorization." Klaus swallowed visibly. "I used pliers yesterday evening to adjust a loose fitting on the glass rack. I returned them immediately afterward." "And today, did anyone request access to these tools?" "Non, monsieur," Klaus replied, though his hands had begun to tremble again. Poirot moved toward the service area with purposeful steps, his keen eyes missing nothing. The toolkit lay exactly where described, its contents apparently undisturbed. Yet something in his expression suggested deeper consideration. "The chain securing Herr Hertig's dispatch case," he murmured, more to himself than to the group, was not cut cleanly but wrenched apart with considerable force. This suggests not the quiet precision of poisoning, but a moment of sudden violence, perhaps even struggle. His gaze returned to Klaus with that peculiar intensity that made the steward shift uncomfortably. Your hands show evidence of recent injury. You claim scalding from the kettle, yet the marking appears more consistent with friction burns, as though you had grasped something that was then pulled away with considerable force. Klaus's face drained of color. "No, monsieur, it was the kettle handle. I swear this upon my mother's grave." "Yet you possessed the master key," Poirot continued with inexorable logic. "You had access to the service area where medical supplies might be stored. You knew Herr Hertig's precise habits and preferences, and perhaps," his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "you harbored resentment toward a patron whose legendary precision extended to his treatment of service staff." The accusation struck Klaus like a physical blow. Mrs. Reeford leaned forward with evident satisfaction. "He does appear frightfully guilty, doesn't he? That furtive manner, the convenient injury." Dr. Baumann observed the steward with clinical detachment. "His physiological responses are certainly consistent with extreme stress, rapid pulse, elevated perspiration, trembling extremities." Young Harper nodded with the calculating precision of his banking background. A man in his position, handling valuable items daily, might well be tempted by opportunity. The collective weight of suspicion settled upon Klaus like a shroud. He appeared utterly overwhelmed, stammering incoherent denials, while the passengers regarded him with the satisfied relief of those who had found a suitable target for their fears. Yet Poirot remained curiously detached from this consensus, his remarkable eyes moving from the accused steward to study the brass fittings of the carriage door, then the precise angle of snow accumulation upon the window ledges. "It is true," he conceded slowly, his voice cutting through the murmuring accusations, "that Klaus possessed opportunity and means. But the manner of the chain's destruction suggests a force quite beyond what one might expect from even the strongest steward. And the timing—" He paused, his head tilting with that bird-like attention that indicated complete focus. "It remains most peculiar." He turned back toward the relentless snowfall beyond the windows, his reflection ghost-like against the white wilderness. "The truly cunning criminal, mes amis, does not merely commit murder. They arrange circumstances so that the most obvious solution becomes the most misleading. The little gray cells must never be satisfied with convenient answers, however compelling they may appear." Though the passengers might have settled upon Klaus as their culprit, Poirot's subtle reservation suggested that the truth remained hidden beneath yet another layer of deception. The first false lead had been presented with masterful precision, and Hercule Poirot, as always, found himself in disagreement with the obvious conclusion. Outside, the storm continued its assault upon their elegant prison, while within, a killer of remarkable sophistication watched the proceedings with satisfaction, knowing that their carefully constructed misdirection was performing exactly as intended. Poirot's skepticism regarding Klaus's guilt had begun to permeate the saloon car's atmosphere, creating an undercurrent of unease that challenged the passengers' collective relief. Rising with characteristic precision, he approached the trembling steward with the measured steps of one following a predetermined path of inquiry. "Klaus, mon ami," he said with gentle authority, "there remains something that troubles the orderly mind. You delivered the tisane at 11:52. Yet during our discussion, I observe that your distress extends beyond mere accusation. Perhaps there is something more you wish to share." The steward's hands trembled as he wrung them together, his eyes darting nervously between Poirot and the assembled passengers. "Monsieur Poirot, there is something I thought insignificant at the time, but now—" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "When I delivered the tisane, Herr Hertig was not alone in his compartment." This revelation struck the group like a thunderbolt. Every eye turned toward Klaus with sharp attention as he continued, his voice gaining strength from the relief of confession. I heard voices, his and another's, speaking in low tones through the door, German, I believe, though I could not distinguish the words. When I knocked, the conversation ceased immediately, and only Herr Hertig appeared to accept the tray. Mademoiselle Odette's face went absolutely white, while Mrs. Rowford leaned forward with undisguised fascination. The weathered ski instructor observed these reactions with that dry amusement that seemed to characterize his approach to human folly. A female voice, Poirot repeated thoughtfully, his remarkable eyes moving systematically among the assembled faces. And this mysterious visitor departed without being observed? The corridor is long, monsieur. One could exit unseen if careful about timing. Poirot nodded slowly, then requested that each passenger extend their hands for examination. The chain securing Herr Hertig's dispatch case was wrenched apart with considerable violence. Such force leaves distinctive marks upon the hands that employ it. One by one he examined each person's hands with clinical precision. Klaus's reddened thumb showed evidence of scalding, as claimed. Mrs. Reeford's manicured fingers bore no suspicious marks. Young Harper displayed a fresh paper cut, which he attributed to his correspondence work. The Reverend Blythe's hands showed a crescent of raw skin between thumb and forefinger. An old habit, he explained. I twist my ring when anxious. Most illuminating, Poirot murmured, though his expression suggested deeper consideration. Now, if you would permit me to examine the scene once more. In Hertig's compartment corridor, he knelt beside the threshold, his keen eyes studying details that had escaped ordinary observation. Observe these scratches in the polished wood near the doorframe. Fresh marks made within hours. They suggest something metallic was dragged across this surface with considerable force. Dr. Baumann bent to examine the evidence. Consistent with a chain being pulled taut, perhaps during struggle. It was at this moment that the train lurched violently, a grinding impact that sent passengers bracing themselves against walls and seats. Unlike the gentle pressure of the earlier avalanche, this was a violent, jarring collision that spoke of genuine catastrophe. Conductor Dubois rushed to the window, his face draining of color. Mon Dieu, another slide, much larger. It has struck the forward cars. Panic rippled through the saloon car as the implications became clear. Mrs. Rayford shrieked, clutching her brother's arm, while even Dr. Baumann's clinical composure wavered. "Klaus!" Dubois suddenly exclaimed. "He went to the service pantry for brandy just moments ago." A small group, led by the conductor and including myself, made our way carefully through the now damaged corridor. The air grew colder, and fine snow sifted through newly opened cracks in the train's elegant shell. We found the service pantry door hanging askew, its interior a chaos of collapsed shelves and shattered crockery. And there, amidst the wreckage, lay Klaus, his body twisted unnaturally beneath fallen debris, a heavy iron pot beside him, its base dented and stained. Dr. Baumann knelt quickly beside the fallen steward, then shook her head gravely. He is dead. His neck is broken, but this was no accident of the avalanche alone. This pot was applied with deliberate, lethal intent. The cold realization seeped through us like mountain air through cracked glass. Klaus, the man everyone had suspected of murder, was now himself a victim. The killer had struck again, ruthlessly eliminating the obvious suspect even amidst natural disaster. As we returned to the saloon car with this grim news, I observed Poirot's expression with growing unease. His face showed no surprise, only the satisfied look of one whose deductions had been confirmed by events. "So," he murmured quietly, "our killer demonstrates remarkable boldness, striking twice within hours. They have eliminated the convenient scapegoat, mes amis, which means the real murderer walks among us still, and they are far more dangerous than we initially supposed." The storm continued its assault outside, but within our elegant prison, a predator had revealed themselves through action rather than words. The psychological game was about to begin in earnest, and the stakes had just become infinitely more deadly. The announcement of Klaus's death settled over the saloon car like a funeral shroud, transforming the elegant space into something far more sinister. The passengers, who moments before had found comfort in having identified a convenient suspect, now faced the terrifying reality that a killer of remarkable cunning walked among them still. Mrs. Reeford had finally achieved her threatened faint, slumping dramatically against her brother's shoulder, while even Dr. Bauman's clinical composure showed hairline cracks. Poirot observed this transformation with the keen interest of a naturalist studying a rare species under stress. Rising with characteristic precision, he addressed Conductor Dubois with quiet authority. The pantry must be sealed immediately, and no one, absolutely no one, is to approach either crime scene without my express permission. Our killer has demonstrated remarkable boldness, striking twice within hours while maintaining their facade of innocence. He moved toward the damaged corridor with measured steps, his remarkable eyes missing nothing. In the wreckage of the service pantry, Klaus lay motionless beneath fallen debris, the heavy iron pot that had ended his life resting nearby with grim finality. Dr. Bauman's examination had confirmed what was already evident. This was no accident of the avalanche, but deliberate, calculated murder. Poirot did not rush his examination. He surveyed the scene with methodical attention, noting the confined space and the considerable force required to deliver such a blow. As his gaze swept the debris-strewn floor, something caught his attention, a tiny object that gleamed faintly beneath Klaus's outstretched hand. With delicate precision, he used his penknife to nudge aside a shard of broken glass, revealing a single freshwater pearl, perfectly formed and utterly incongruous amidst the chaos. More significantly, Klaus's left hand bore a small circular abrasion between thumb and forefinger. Not the scalding he had claimed, but something far more telling. "Hastings," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "observe the pearl and the mark upon Klaus's hand. These details will prove most illuminating when properly understood." Returning to the saloon car, Poirot settled into his corner seat and began the systematic questioning that would either expose or eliminate each suspect. "We shall now examine means and opportunity with mathematical precision," he announced. "Who among you possesses the strength to wield such a weapon effectively?" The weathered ski instructor produced a small metal carabiner from his pocket. "Any climber carries tools that could serve such purpose," he observed with characteristic dryness. "A matter of leverage and proper application of force." Poirot examined the device without touching it, measuring its dimensions against his memory of the scratches near Hertig's compartment. "Most illuminating. Now, if you would all extend your hands for examination." The chain securing Herr Hertig's dispatch case was wrenched apart with considerable violence, leaving distinctive marks upon the hands that employed such force. One by one, he studied each person's hands with clinical precision. Young Harper displayed a fresh abrasion on his cufflink, which he attributed nervously to catching it on the writing desk drawer. The examination revealed various minor injuries and marks, each explained with varying degrees of credibility. It was then that Mademoiselle Odette, her composure finally cracking under the mounting pressure, spoke with desperate clarity. "I must confess, I did visit Uncle Caspar's compartment this morning between 11:30 and 11:45. He had summoned me to discuss my indiscretions, but he was alive and unharmed when I left, reviewing documents from his dispatch case." This revelation sent visible shock waves through the assembled passengers. Young Harper shifted uncomfortably before adding his own confession. "I must admit that my departure from London banking was not entirely voluntary. I'd been involved in certain transactions that, while not illegal, were ethically questionable. If such activities were documented by Herr Hertig..." His sister, Mrs. Rayford, having recovered from her theatrical faint, regarded him with an expression that seemed more calculated than shocked. "Edward, you never mentioned such difficulties." Dr. Baumann observed these proceedings with renewed clinical interest. Such revelations suggest that Herr Hertig's dispatch case contained more than bearer bonds, perhaps a comprehensive record of irregular financial practices that could destroy reputations and careers. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving systematically from passenger to passenger. "Indeed, we now understand that multiple individuals possessed compelling motives for eliminating Herr Hertig. The question becomes, who possessed both the psychological capacity to commit murder twice and the specific knowledge to accomplish it with such sophistication?" Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, emphasizing their isolation in this elegant prison. The killer had revealed themselves through action rather than words, demonstrating cunning that matched their ruthlessness. The psychological game was about to begin in earnest, and Hercule Poirot's legendary powers of deduction would soon be tested by an adversary whose methods defied conventional logic. The little grey cells were working with desperate intensity, for the hidden clue had been discovered, the motives were becoming clear, and the final confrontation was drawing inexorably closer. The chilling reality of Klaus's murder had transformed the elegant saloon car into something far more sinister than a mere luxury conveyance delayed by weather. The passengers, who moments before had found relief in identifying a convenient suspect, now faced the terrifying certainty that a killer of remarkable cunning walked among them still. Mrs. Rayford had recovered from her theatrical faint, but her usual dramatics were replaced by genuine pallor, while even Dr. Baumann's clinical composure showed hairline cracks of genuine concern. Poirot observed this transformation with the keen interest of a naturalist studying a rare species under extreme pressure. Rising with characteristic precision, he addressed Conductor Dubois with quiet authority that brooked no argument. "The missing master key presents us with a most serious complication. Klaus's key ring was found empty. Someone now possesses the means to enter any compartment without force and to arrange evidence as they see fit." This revelation struck the group like a physical blow. The implications were immediate and terrifying. Their killer could move freely through the train, manipulating evidence and potentially striking again with impunity. Therefore, Poirot continued with methodical precision, "We must act swiftly before our unknown adversary improves their already considerable advantage. I propose a systematic examination of every compartment, conducted with proper witnesses to ensure nothing can be disputed later." He turned toward the assembled passengers with that peculiar courtesy that somehow managed to be both respectful and inexorable. "But first, a small matter that may prove illuminating. Ladies, if you wear pearls, would you be so kind as to display them? A trifle has been discovered that may help establish certain movements." The request sent a visible tremor through the group. Mrs. Rayford touched her throat reflexively, her fingers finding the elegant strand that adorned her ensemble. Surely such a common ornament could belong to anyone. "Au contraire, madame," Poirot replied with gentle precision. "Freshwater pearls possessed distinctive characteristics that distinguish them from their saltwater cousins. This particular specimen," he produced the small lustrous orb found beneath Klaus's hand, "shows signs of recent detachment, torn rather than cut from its mounting." Mrs. Rayford's pearls proved intact and well strung, as did Mademoiselle Odette's modest gold jewelry. Dr. Baumann wore no ornaments at all, while Madame Varenne, the celebrated contralto who had remained largely in the background, suddenly became the focus of intense scrutiny. Upon her wrist gleamed a bracelet of lustrous pearls, but there, near the delicate clasp, was an unmistakable gap. Her rotund manager, who had been conducting invisible orchestras with nervous hands throughout the crisis, produced a handkerchief and dabbed at his perspiring brow. "A disaster of nothing," he declared with forced lightness. "Last evening, the clasp caught upon Madame's fan. I warned her to be careful, but artistry, you understand? It lives in the moment. Poirot's eyes warmed with that deceptive gentleness that often preceded his most devastating observations. Indeed. And you repaired this damage when? This morning, early. I tied a new knot to secure the remaining pearls. Most devoted, you will permit me to examine this repair later. Poirot's gaze moved to the silk scarf draped elegantly around Madame's throat, and with delicate precision, he touched its edge with a fingertip. When he withdrew his hand, it bore a faint, crystalline dusting that caught the car's muted light. Young Harper, who had been following this exchange with growing unease, suddenly spoke with involuntary recognition. Crystallized honey. The implication struck the assembled group with the force of revelation. Honey had been used to mask the bitter taste of chloral hydrate in Hertig's tisane, and now traces of it appeared on the clothing of someone who claimed to have avoided the service area entirely. Most illuminating, Poirot murmured, though his expression suggested this was merely one piece of a far more complex puzzle. Now, if you will permit me, we shall conduct our systematic examination of the compartments. Conductor Dubois, you and I, with 2 witnesses, will inspect each space methodically. The search proved both methodical and revealing. Compartment after compartment yielded the ordinary detritus of interrupted journeys, hastily packed luggage, folded blankets, the domestic chaos of travelers caught unprepared by circumstance. At Hertig's door, Poirot paused, his remarkable eyes studying the latch mechanism and the fresh scratches in the polished wood that spoke of violent struggle. When they reached Madame Varenne's compartment, her manager protested with theatrical indignation, but Poirot's courtesy proved implacable. The vanity case revealed its bright contents with damning precision. Powders, pastilles, and most significantly, a small jar of honey with its lid crusted faintly at the rim. The bracelet repair lay in the traveling tray, showing not 1 but 2 gaps where pearls had been lost, with faint impressions in the velvet indicating recent disturbance. Most instructive, Poirot observed quietly, replacing each item with greater care than its owner had shown. The final revelation came in an unremarkable compartment toward the train's rear. When Poirot knelt and pressed lightly upon the molding beneath the window, a narrow panel sprang inward just enough to admit a searching hand. He did not reach within, but his satisfied expression told me everything necessary. "It is as I suspected," he murmured with quiet triumph. "We shall not disturb it yet. The proper dramatic moment requires its appropriate stage." When we returned to the saloon car, the atmosphere had grown thick with anticipation and dread. The passengers looked up as one, their faces reflecting the desperate hope that their ordeal might soon reach its conclusion. Poirot settled into his corner seat with characteristic precision, adjusting his tie and smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his sleeve. Through the panoramic windows, the storm continued its relentless assault, but within our elegant prison, the final act was about to commence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with quiet authority that commanded absolute attention, "the little gray cells have completed their work. Every fact has been examined, every contradiction resolved, every motive understood. The time has come for the final gathering, where truth will be revealed and justice will be served." His remarkable eyes moved systematically from passenger to passenger, cataloguing final details with the precision of a master craftsman putting finishing touches upon his greatest work. The killer believed they had constructed the perfect crime, 2 murders disguised as natural death and accident, with convenient scapegoats to bear the blame. But the truly cunning criminal always makes one small mistake, one tiny detail overlooked in their haste that unravels the entire intricate tapestry of their deception. Outside, the mountains stood motionless in their ancient patience, while within the wounded train, Hercule Poirot prepared to demonstrate once again why his reputation as the world's greatest detective remained unassailable. The psychological game had reached its climax, and the final revelation was about to strip away every carefully constructed facade to expose the truth beneath. The stage was perfectly set, the evidence meticulously gathered, and the moment of justice had finally arrived. The announcement of the final gathering transformed the elegant saloon car into something that resembled a courtroom more than a luxury conveyance. The passengers arranged themselves with unconscious precision, understanding that reputations and perhaps lives hung in the balance of what was about to unfold. Through the panoramic windows, the storm showed signs of abating, revealing glimpses of the magnificent peaks that had witnessed this drama of greed and murder. Poirot positioned himself where the filtered afternoon light would fall most favorably upon his impeccable ensemble, his patent leather shoes gleaming with defiant brilliance against the car's muted elegance. His remarkable eyes moved systematically from passenger to passenger, cataloguing final details with the precision of a master craftsman examining his greatest work. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with that particular courtesy that somehow managed to be both respectful and inexorable, "we have before us crimes of remarkable sophistication. 2 murders committed within hours, each designed to appear as something entirely different from its true nature. The killer demonstrated not only cunning, but profound understanding of human psychology, arranging circumstances so that suspicion would fall upon the most obvious candidates, while the true perpetrator remained hidden in plain sight. He moved with characteristic precision toward the center of the car. Let us restore order to time itself. At 11:45, Klaus prepared the tisane from Herr Hertig's sealed herbs. At 11:52, it was delivered to a compartment where voices could be heard. German, intimate, urgent. This removes entirely the possibility that poison was added during preparation. The chloral hydrate was administered directly to Herr Hertig during conversation with his killer. His gaze settled upon Dr. Baumann. "Your diagnosis of chloral hydrate poisoning was precise, masked by honey to eliminate the bitter taste. But observe where we find traces of this honey, not merely in the common jar, but crystallized upon the silk scarf of Madame Varenne. The coarser crystals from the pantry jar, distinctive from refined honey carried for vocal purposes. Madame Varenne drew herself up with theatrical dignity, but her carefully maintained composure showed hairline cracks. Many singers carry honey for the voice. This proves nothing substantial." "Au contraire, madame," Poirot replied with gentle precision. "By itself it proves little. But combined with this," he produced the lustrous pearl found beneath Klaus's hand, "it becomes most illuminating. Your bracelet shows not 1 gap, but 2, with fresh impressions in the velvet indicating recent, violent detachment. Klaus grasped desperately at your jewelry during his final struggle in the pantry." Her rotund manager produced his handkerchief with trembling hands, dabbing at perspiration that had nothing to do with temperature. "Monsieur Poirot, surely you cannot suggest that an artist of Madame's international stature would engage in such sordid—" "I suggest nothing," Poirot interrupted with inexorable logic. "I present facts with mathematical precision. Your hands, Signor, show distinctive scoring across the palm and bruising at the heel, consistent with applying tools for leverage. The fresh scratches near Hertig's door frame indicate his dispatch case chain was looped and wrenched with considerable force. Madame possesses neither the strength nor the practical knowledge for such work. But you, who manages the mechanical requirements of a great career, you possess both capability and desperate motive." The psychological profile emerged with devastating clarity. Herr Hertig had discovered systematic embezzlement from Madame's earnings over several years. His dispatch case contained detailed financial records proving fraudulent management of contracts, diverted payments, and forged authorizations. The evidence would have destroyed both your careers and resulted in criminal prosecution. Madame Varenne's theatrical facade finally crumbled entirely. 20 years of sacrifice, of building an international reputation, all to be destroyed by one vindictive banker who understood nothing of artistic necessity, only his precious precision and moral superiority. You visited Hertig's compartment under pretense of urgent negotiation, Poirot continued methodically. When Klaus knocked with the tisane, you concealed yourself behind the door. After his departure, you administered the chloral hydrate dissolved in honey, presenting it as a gesture of reconciliation. Hertig succumbed quickly, but not before struggling to protect his precious case, tearing your bracelet in the process. The confession came with broken dignity. The avalanche provided perfect cover for retrieving the case. But Klaus had observed too much. The scarf, the honey traces, the signs of struggle. In the pantry, when he bent to retrieve brandy, She could not complete the sentence. Your manager struck him with the iron pot, using the avalanche's noise to mask the sound, then arranged debris to suggest accidental death. As Conductor Dubois approached with restraints, Poirot retrieved the dispatch case from its hiding place beneath the window molding. The evidence of your crimes, carefully preserved by your own hand. The elegant killer made no attempt to flee. Where could she go in a train trapped by snow in the heart of the Alps? As she was led away, her theatrical dignity intact even in defeat, Poirot settled back with characteristic precision. Human nature, he observed quietly, remains constant whether upon mountain or stage. Vanity, desperation, and small improvisations that become great crimes. Yet even in the snow, the footprints of truth remain visible to those with patience to read them properly. The little gray cells had once again demonstrated that no crime, however cleverly constructed, could withstand methodical application of logic and observation. The arrest of Madame Varenne and her manager brought a peculiar quiet to the saloon corps, broken only by the diminishing howl of wind against the panoramic windows. The storm that had trapped them in this elegant prison was finally beginning to exhaust itself, revealing glimpses of the magnificent alpine peaks that had witnessed their drama of greed and murder with ancient, impassive dignity. Poirot remained in his corner seat, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision while his remarkable eyes surveyed the remaining passengers with evident satisfaction. The little gray cells had completed their work with mathematical precision, yet something in his expression suggested that the full truth required one final revelation to achieve perfect clarity. There remains, he announced with that particular courtesy that had characterized his entire investigation, one small matter that must be addressed before we consider this affair properly concluded. The question of motive, while established, deserves complete illumination for the satisfaction of justice and the education of those who have witnessed these events. He rose with fluid grace, moving toward the recovered dispatch case with the measured steps of one savoring a moment of professional triumph. Herr Hertig's reputation for discretion was legendary, but it masked something far more significant than mere banking services. This case contained evidence of a systematic network of financial manipulation spanning several European capitals, with Madame Varenne as merely one victim among many. Opening the leather portfolio with delicate precision, he revealed documents that spoke of international intrigue far beyond simple embezzlement. Bearer bonds, certainly, but also correspondence detailing currency manipulation, forged letters of credit, and, most significantly, a complete list of prominent individuals whose careers had been systematically exploited by a network of apparently respectable managers and agents. The implications struck the assembled passengers with the force of revelation. Young Harper's face went absolutely white as he recognized the scope of the conspiracy that had nearly claimed him as well. Mademoiselle Odette pressed her hand to her throat, understanding finally why her uncle had been so determined to expose what he had discovered. The truly remarkable aspect, Poirot continued with quiet admiration for the complexity he had unraveled, was how our killer's desperation led to their undoing. Had they simply fled upon discovering Hertig's evidence, they might have escaped entirely. But vanity demanded they retrieve the incriminating documents, and desperation required they eliminate the witness who had observed too much. Dr. Baumann observed with clinical precision. The psychological profile suggests individuals who had lived so long with deception that they believed their own performances. The boundary between artistic persona and criminal reality had dissolved entirely. The Reverend Blythe, whose gentle features had been marked by the tragedy he had witnessed, spoke with quiet wisdom. Pride, as Scripture teaches us, indeed goeth before destruction. They could not bear to see their carefully constructed reputations crumble, even when escape was possible. Through the windows, the afternoon light was beginning to strengthen, and in the distance came the welcome sound of mechanical engines. The snow plow had finally broken through, bringing with it the Swiss authorities who would complete the formal procedures of justice. As the first uniformed officers boarded the train, their boots crunching on the cleared snow, Poirot presented them with the bound culprits and the dispatch case, his report delivered with concise precision, leaving no detail unaddressed. The Swiss police, efficient and thorough as their national reputation demanded, processed the scene with admirable competence. "You see, Hastings," he said, turning to me as the criminals were led away, "the human heart is a complex and often contradictory organ. It can produce great beauty and terrible ugliness, sometimes simultaneously. The stage, the concert hall, the financial market, they are all but different backdrops for the same eternal drama of human nature." He picked up a stray snowflake that had landed on the window pane, observing its delicate, intricate structure before it melted into a tiny bead of water. "Order and method, mon ami. They are the keys to understanding the world, whether it is the design of a snowflake or the labyrinthine paths of a criminal mind. For even the most elaborate deception eventually betrays itself through a lack of perfect symmetry." As our rescue train began its careful descent towards civilization, Poirot settled into his new seat with characteristic precision, arranging his traveling rug with the same attention to detail that had solved 2 murders in the space of a morning. The magnificent peaks of the Alps rolled past our windows, their snow-covered faces catching the late afternoon light like scattered diamonds, beautiful and eternal and utterly indifferent to the human dramas that played out in their shadow. The remaining passengers sat in contemplative silence, each processing the revelations in their own way. Mrs. Brieford had finally abandoned her theatrical affectations, while her brother Harper stared out at the mountains with the expression of one who had glimpsed the abyss and stepped back just in time. Mademoiselle Odette held the philosophical text she had been reading when this all began, but her eyes were fixed on the passing landscape, perhaps finding in its permanence some comfort after the morning's revelations about human frailty. "The mountains, mon ami," Poirot observed with quiet satisfaction as the train carried us safely down from the treacherous heights. "They have witnessed our little tragedy and found it wanting. Tomorrow the snow will cover all traces of our passage, but justice will remain, precise, methodical, and as enduring as the peaks themselves." He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a moment of well-earned repose. "The little grey cells, they are satisfied. Order has been restored, truth has been revealed, and the innocent have been protected from further harm. What more can one ask of a day's work in the service of justice?" As the train descended through the Alpine valleys toward the lights of civilization, I reflected on how Hercule Poirot had once again demonstrated that no crime, however cleverly constructed, could withstand the methodical application of logic, observation, and an understanding of human nature that bordered on the supernatural. The affair at death on the Glacier Express had reached its conclusion, and justice, like the eternal mountains themselves, had proven both patient and inexorable. In the gathering twilight of the Alpine evening, the last echoes of our adventure faded into memory, leaving only the satisfied quiet of a mystery solved and a case closed with the precision that had made Hercule Poirot the most celebrated detective in all the world.